Morena koutou. I've just invited my friend Shane from Medical Cannabis Awareness New Zealand to sit next to me as my technical advice, given that the submission from the Green Party speaks to our support for Medical Cannabis Awareness New Zealand submission too. So there are just a few things that I'd like to point out first and foremost, and then we can get into any questions, kick it around, which was highlighted quite a bit in the discussion previously. So first and foremost, I just want to note that I am not here to relitigate the Green Party Members' Bill. That was voted down, that was the will of Parliament. But what I am here to do is to speak to the fact that so many of the speeches that we heard both on my bill and also on this government bill were such that we would like to see this bill advance. We would like to see extended, especially to those with chronic pain. The other thing that I'd like to note is that we're all aware that this bill in its present form does not seem to satisfy the standards that we would like to see. I'd just like to read a quote. All it does is create a statutory defence for the possession and use of illicit cannabis by people who are terminally ill and expected by the doctors to die within 12 months. But that doesn't make medicinal cannabis legal. It doesn't address access. It doesn't address availability. It doesn't address the quality of the product, and it certainly doesn't address affordability. It doesn't even provide a legal way for terminally ill patients to get the medicines that they require. I believe that's a brilliant summation of the flaws in the bill as it currently stands. And I'm not seeking to deeply politicise this, but that was your speech, Nikki Wagner, during the first reading of this government bill. And it highlights the two issues that we'd really like to bring to the fore and are present in the Green Party submission. So what we'd like to see is in Section 2AA, an addition for the ability for terminally ill patients to cultivate. I believe that we're all quite aware of the gaping black hole that presently exists. I'm aware that my bill was evidently voted down because people were concerned about the provision, the so-called grow your own provision. But what we have right here is people still needing to get access to cannabis illegally. Somebody has to grow it. The other thing that we would like to add is for a nominated person to be covered under Section 2AB. If neither of those things can be fulfilled, then I would hesitate to suggest to the committee that we could perhaps throw around the idea of the likes of an amnesty for the sake of this stopgap, to actually recognise the fact that this stuff is presently happening in the illegal market. Otherwise, law-abiding citizens are presently risking jail time in order to provide medicinal cannabis to those in their community for no reason other than to alleviate suffering. These people are colloquially named the Green Berries. There's a number of them in the likes of Nelson, and they've made news recently. The other opportunity, it was kicked around throughout the New Zealand Drug Foundation submission, is to potentially create some form of independent board to take it outside of the medical profession. I believe Shane's Medicinal Cannabis Awareness New Zealand submission speaks to this. Some kind of independent group outside of the medical profession, comprising members from the medical profession, potentially, who is able to prescribe or certify patients. So it takes away that hesitancy that the medical profession may feel ethically, or perhaps legally, or perhaps inside the profession. So on that point, I'd just like to summarise by saying that we can do better. And if our hesitation as lawmakers on this point, having noted all of these concerns that have come to the fore already in this discussion, if it is too hard, if we're simply just concerned that it's too hard, then I invite you to listen to the thousands of submitters about the heartache and pain suffering under this archaic law, which is presently so unfit for purpose, because something does have to change. And I would absolutely like to talk over the point of Ross Bell, that I would really like to see, the Green Party would really like to see the patient voice centred here in the middle of this corridor. Thank you very much. Do we have any questions?
Questions? I've got a question.
Yep.
Actually. And it really is about choice of the patient and what is a medicine, and I guess the ability of people to choose to self-medicate versus a doctor prescribing or thinking that cannabis is the answer to their pain, their suffering. I mean, you're talking about a regime where for all intents and purposes, the doctor is not even in the equation?
No, we're talking about still needing the doctor to be involved in that process. So what we think, and this is just to kind of go off the cuff, but it seems to be that the government's bill puts the cart before the horse. And what I mean by that is that it's as though people need to go out on a limb and risk being, put in jail by accessing this cannabis illegally. Then, the police coming into the equation and going, okay, you've got some certification that you have a terminal illness, so therefore that certification also not speaking to the fact that they can get access to illegal cannabis. Then the police say, okay, we're not going to prosecute. But there is also the potential that certain people who don't have terminal illness may be dragged before the court with chronic pain or otherwise and have to prove how in pain they are or whether they have terminal illness or otherwise. What we're seeking to do is say, look, we either have a medical professional, so a doctor, or an independent board that can certify a patient to say, yes, you could benefit from the use of medicinal cannabis, so we're going to certify you. And then you can either have certification to cultivate yourself and therefore to have access to that medicinal cannabis or nominate somebody.
But that's the issue, because you're talking about the certification to use a product. Self-cultivation doesn't guarantee that the product that they're cultivating meets minimum standards about what constitutes a medicine. And there's an inherent illogic in what you're proposing. I would not allow individual cultivation because that isn't a medicine.
I would just state on that point first and foremost before going to Shane for the technical point. But the very reason that we are having this debate is for decades patients have been self-medicating. The very reason that we have moved away from this war on drugs rhetoric is that we've realised that it's failed and we're now seeking different avenues. We know for a fact that certain people are reporting anecdotally that it has worked for them. We have spoken, I was sitting in on the committee, we have spoken about the fact that there is a dearth of evidence at the moment. There is a dearth of evidence because of the war on drugs, because the medical profession has not been able to undertake requisite tests that they have been able to take with other drugs, for example. What that dearth of evidence, that void is currently being filled with is anecdotal evidence from patients, and that's the best that we've got to go with at the moment. So that's the point around patient voice. And Shane, if you'd like to speak to the...
At the moment, we have a big disparity in the costs when we talk about prescribed products. So people don't go out and cultivate their own opium poppies to make their own morphine and methadone because it's $5 for a month script. But if we rely on the legal system for the foreseeable future, patients are going to be paying $600 to $1,200 a month at a minimum. For an epileptic child, that could be $200 plus a day. And so we've got this big disconnect. The product, Sativex, is about $1,200 a month, and it's got about $150 in grass at black market prices. And then we're talking about really sick people that are on ACC benefits and sickness bennies, and they can't afford these products. And even with this regime you're setting up, that's years away from happening. So in the short term, is it acceptable for the police to be hauling really sick people before the courts? I would argue that is no.
Do you know how many people the police are hauling?
No, because they don't record the amount of people using medical as a defence. They don't record it, so there's no way of finding that out. From our numbers, when we look at it, we're focusing on severe patients that are much easier to push for legal access. And the Global Drug Survey of 2017 suggested that 12% of cannabis users in New Zealand were using it mostly or solely for medicinal purposes. So if we base that back on the 2012-13 Cannabis Drug Survey, use survey in New Zealand that the Ministry of Health did, we're still talking about 50,000 patients that are in the severe category.
Nikki?
I'm just interested in finding out about what's being charged because this is the issue. The issue is, and we've heard earlier today about even how they balance the cannabinoids from THC and CBD. How they balance those can make a difference to the actual result and how that actually works. And so there's quite a technical understanding of how we use these particular parts of the plant and how we can make sure that it's effective.
So you're speaking to the efficacy and the dosage with regard to self-cultivation.
The side effects, that sort of thing as well.
Self-cultivation, the LD50 or the toxicity dose to actually really harm yourself. You're talking about smoking a telephone pot before you can kill yourself.
Yeah, patients, you're not really wanting to kill people.
No, not. But like at home, there's enough Class B drugs at home in my house that are prescribed, to kill a whole family.
And I just have one sub on that, sorry. That was the thing that's interesting. I'm really interested in what you're saying, Chloe, that the reason there's no evidence that cannabis works medicinally is because...
I didn't say that there was no evidence. I said that there is very little.
You used the term dirt, which tends to be not much. Was because it was a Class C drug, or whatever class it is drug. But yet we do have quite a lot of evidence of other drugs that are even more highly rated that people do use for medicinal purposes.
So we've got the issue that cannabis is not prone to being patented. So to actually get the phase 3 clinical trials to give you the clinical certainty that pharmacists and prescribers would like, you're talking tens of millions of dollars, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars to actually prove it hand on heart to say it works. So where we're at with the research is there's a whole lot of preclinical evidence in the lab dish and animal studies. They're saying it could work. There's there's an emerging torrent of phase 2 trials that's saying it should work, but that doesn't give you the clinical certainty. And then over at the far end, you've got the patients confirming both the phase 2s and the preclinical data. The problem with the research is we've got a company called GW Pharma. They make Satilex. They are researching Epidiolex for epilepsy, probably sinking hundreds of millions of US dollars into research to prove that CBD works for epilepsy. And then this Canadian company, Tilray, makes a product called CBD 100, which is an unregistered medicine, no research behind it, but it does the same job, and it's available here, now, and cheaper. If we wait for the research, it's a stalling tactic, we wait forever. I feel we should leave it up to the GPs and the medical specialists to use their common knowledge and assess the benefits versus the harms, because at the moment, we've got some really harmful stuff being given to pain patients, and cannabis is far more benign.
So that's really another crux of this bill, isn't it? The fact that we say actually the medical profession has to make these decisions, and you can see why they're a little bit cagey, obviously, because there isn't hard evidence to go.
My experience is that the younger end of the profession is more on board with it, and for our severe patients we focus on, the GPs would happily prescribe it if they could. However, going further up the chain to the specialists, as is required now for the non-pharmaceutical products, they are far more resistant. And this was echoed back to me when I met with a certain ministry official, and they reported back from a World Health Organisation presentation that changing the prescribing habits of doctors over the age of 35 is a futile task.
Well, we will ask
I've got 2 more questions,
Yep.
Liz, and then Andy, and then that's... Sorry.
I mean, my biggest concern, I guess, with the growing alongside is the associations that have come out with psychosis. And I guess the issue is if we are growing our own and can't get the CBD, THC, psychoactive components right, I mean, what protections do you see would be in place? Because it's not, there's anecdotal evidence that it helps patients, but we've also got evidence of harm. And when you've got to grow your own situation, it's very difficult. So,
So I would just like to state that this is why it's really important that there is medical professional oversight of what's happening, and why we don't want to be putting the cart before the horse and just saying to terminally ill patients, for example, as is under the current scheme that's being proposed by the government's bill, that they should just go out into the ether, into this black hole, and somehow magic up this illicit medicinal cannabis that they're not going to be charged for having. Again, it still has to be grown somewhere, but this bill doesn't seek to address it. We're seeking to say that those patients should still be monitored. They should still be able to go back to their GP and be open about the fact that they are using medicinal cannabis or otherwise, which would absolutely mitigate some of those risks around psychosis or otherwise, because it's simply about that monitoring throughout the process of utilising medicinal cannabis.
And this is where I guess it comes back to that discussion about if you've got severe and debilitating versus any spectrum of chronic pain, because it's the fact that we'll be weighing up the risks and the benefits, and clearly there is issues with risk of taking the product as well as benefits. And so that's where, again, thinking through where we draw that line in terms of those who've got a medical defence versus those that haven't. Whether it should be slightly broader, but if we take it too broad, we may end up the risk.
Well, I think that's a question for the committee, right? I mean, do we want to give it over to the discretion of the medical profession to say what they deem to be, as we do with a number of different ailments, whether they be chronic pain, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, or other kind of ailments that can benefit from pain medication. But what we're currently leaving wide open, I believe, and this has been touched on multiple times, it was in all of the advice that was given to the Minister, released proactively, of course, that we currently have a situation where police on the front lines are being quite open about the fact that they are de facto decriminalising the use of cannabis for medicinal reasons or recreational reasons or otherwise. What we are, as the Green Party, concerned about there is that there is no rule of law. So who is being prosecuted there? Because I almost guarantee you that it is not certain classes or demographics of people, and it is very much other classes or demographics of people who will be targeted and prosecuted accordingly.
I can speak a little bit to that on the Section 106 discharge without convictions. The only people I know that are discharged without conviction for medical purposes are old white women. Some people are discharged for growing as much as 62 plants.
Got to be some advantage.
There you go, Nikki, you can be the supplier.
So it's an issue. So when we say older white women, they're being discharged without conviction for importing Class B drugs, cannabis chocolates from the States, for growing 62 plants in one case down in Golden Bay for their husband who had 2 legs removed and phantom limb pain, and another person was growing it in their lounge, and they managed to get discharged without conviction for cultivating in their lounge, but they're all older white women.
Yeah.
So there is a racial bias, but I can't give you numbers. I can only tell you the positive outcome ones because everyone's quite excited when someone gets discharged without conviction.
I guess I think the thing I'm still struggling with is growing your own and not knowing what the THC CBD balance is.
You can get strains. So right now you can go, I can give you a list of websites. You can go online and get strains from all over the world, and they get through customs every time. So you can, people buy strains for a specific ratio. You can get strains that are 1-to-1, so they're Sativex in plant form. You could regulate that so you can actually have a little seedling shop that would just sell the seedlings of a known strength and ratio. The other thing is, most of the harms are around people growing too much cannabis. So you can control that by setting area limits. Some people used to use the term for plant counts, but in California and Colorado, they can grow some pretty big plants now. So the other way to do it is by square metres. When people are growing indoors, they get these little black tents that are 1 by 1 square metre. You might be able to, that's what happens in Canada, you might license someone for 2 grams a day, so that they have a formula, you're allowed 2 square metres of indoor growing to get you the equivalent of about 2 grams a day. There are formulas already out there in Canada that cover all of this.
And New Zealand's really actually quite late to the game internationally on this as well. So I'll note that a number of different members of the Select Committee spoke during the first reading of the bill, speaking to really wanting to see what's happening in other jurisdictions, and I'd really invite you to do so because we have the opportunity to choose the best framework in the world.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Good time.
Thank you.
So we have